University of North Carolina. I will pass on the floor to Aaron as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. I don't have a hat. I wish I did. Now I know where Baimas wears them. Thank you very much for joining this first session this afternoon. And our discussion topic is valuing water. We heard a lot this morning about the challenges around water, and now we're going to start to move towards ideas around solutions and how do we operationalize some of the solutions that we talk about around water. One of the major accomplishments of the high-level panel on water was that it really shifted this conversation from water pricing and water cost to this idea of valuing water and raising awareness about this whole concept. But what does that really mean? And how do we put that into practice? What is water's value? How do we create value for water? How does this actually solve water problems in a meaningful way? And these are the ideas that we're going to explore a little bit in this session. We're very lucky to have two distinguished guests with us who will kick us off with a keynote, and then we'll turn it over to a distinguished panel and talk about the issue a little bit further. And we're very fortunate to be able to start off with Her Excellency Ms. Lindiwe Sisulu, and Minister of Human Settlements, Water and Sanitation from the Republic of South Africa. And I can't think of any other country where valuing water has become so important in the last couple of years. So we really welcome your comments to start us off.
Thank you, Moderator, Mr. Aaron Salzberg, my fellow keynote speaker, Mr. Amwa Awad Sakine, Your Excellencies, distinguished panel members here, representatives of member states and development partners, ladies and gentlemen. This session addresses a very important fundamental question to all of us: value of water against the cost of a water crisis, and to evaluate if we're talking the same thing. Clearly, this is the kind of clarity-seeking theme that can only be advanced if there is confusion or conflict in the defining concept. Moderator, I'll allow the room to find their own definition and positions on this compelling theme. And while they do that, allow me to congratulate the government of Hungary and its people for hosting this hallmark event of the 2019 Budapest Water Summit under the theme Preventing a Water Crisis, an urgent call for decisive action. The Sustainable Development Goals are a universal call from partnerships to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. This call requires of all of us to achieve the same. Hence, at this moment and in the global multilateral history, member states continue to navigate different challenges confronting the political, social, and economic architecture of water through robust engagement at international fora such as we're doing now. We all hope to find a common resolve on water as a resource facing a looming crisis brought to our attention once again through this particular summit. We in South Africa are unfortunately in the top 30 of the driest countries in the world, and as a consequence, periodically experience water crises, such as we are experiencing right now in some regions, which informs our commitment to contribute earnestly to all engagements that seek to avoid this looming water crisis. In the Southern African region, we share rivers. Like many other countries, South Africa shares 60% of its freshwater resources with its neighbors. Therefore, our relations with our partners remain key for economic development and social sustainability. We have just emerged from one of the worst droughts in many years that spanned the period 2014 to 2019, and in some parts of the country, the worst drought in recorded history. The drought conditions are still very serious, and in at least 2 of the 9 provinces, we are still experiencing some drought. Furthermore, unseasonably warm weather also poses a threat for the approaching summer rainfall season, as extreme drought has already started to cripple both agriculture and our water resources. The cost of dealing with these crises as an emergency is extremely high and places additional strain on an already constrained economy. It is therefore necessary, while dealing with these crises, that we focus on a long-term intervention strategy to ensure that we have the necessary water resilience going forward. These long-term interventions do, of course, come at substantial cost to all customers and will have a negative impact on the poor. However, despite South Africa being a semi-arid climate and being a water-stressed country, our average domestic water use is around 237 litres per person per day, which is 64 litres per person per day more than the world average of 173 litres per person per day. Looking at these figures, one would be tempted to ask the question, is this because our people value the consuming water, or is it the low cost of the water itself? It is most likely to be a combination of both, the value and the cost, and points to the need of improved communication and education in terms of the impacts on water on our society. The most recent example of a potential crisis which gained international focus was the way in which we very effectively dealt with the 2015 and 2018 drought in the Western Cape, in general, and in the city in particular. Through a combination of effective management of the available water resources, application of drought tariffs for water consumption, extensive communication campaigns, partnerships with communities, business and agriculture, a crisis was indeed averted. During the height of the drought, domestic water consumption was reduced to approximately 80 litres per person per day, a very, very significant reduction when you compare it with the average that we've always had. Plans are also developed and are currently being implemented for the long-term water security and resilience of the region. This is a very good example of water users getting a much better and realistic appreciation of the value of water. Our people got an understanding of the value of water at this particular period, but also the impact of the cost of water can have in dealing with the crisis in pushing down consumption. In the context of dealing with the crisis, the value of water and the cost of water are not the same thing. Water security and universal access to water will demand necessarily more water, more skills, and better management and improved regulation. We're at a very important historical junction in South Africa in relation to land. We are in the process of redistributing land to right the wrongs of the past, and for this program to be viable, water is essential in land as it is through the entire reform of the economy. Looking beyond dealing with any crisis, we need to bear in mind that water has value, which is cultural, spiritual, and economic, and of course has an impact on the environment. In the South African context, our constitution states that everyone has the right to have access to sufficient water and food. Furthermore, our constitution states that everyone has a right to an environment that is not harmful to health and well-being, to have an environment that is protected for the benefit of present and future generations. Our core focus, therefore, must be a commitment to ensure availability and sustainability, and where these two, which is the value of water and the cost of water, intersect, we have benefited from that. I think I will end there because I would have exceeded my time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you very much, Madam Minister. Before calling up, this is very interesting how you tried to reconcile the costs with the value of water, and I think you're adding cultural, spiritual dimensions to the value of water is very important. But as a minister, I'm sure full cost recovery is still critical?
It is. Of course.
It will, yeah. Just start speaking, they'll take care of it.
No, of course, as a minister, we...
You may just have to hold it up.
Yes, cost is very important because we have had to have a midterm rearrangement of our budget to make sure that we are able to cover the costs of the drought.
Okay, so while value is important, full cost recovery is still important, and how you reconcile those two is the real challenge.
Yeah. How we reconcile the two, there's an intersection there, but we don't believe that either value or cost are synonymous. But they
Perfect.
did intersect in our space, and we got the benefit of that particular intersection.
Great. We'll turn it over to the panel in a minute, but next we'd like to ask His Excellency Mr. Ahmad Awad Sakin, who is the permanent representative of the African Union to the European Union, for his remarks.
Merci au peuple hongrois et à la République de Hongrie.
I'd like to thank the Republic. I would like to thank Hungary, and I would like to thank the Hungarian government for organizing this extremely important meeting or summit. First and foremost, please allow me to raise a question to all of us.
Je pense que cette salle
I do believe that this room, this very hall, was packed this morning, and I wonder how many
utilisait de l'eau ce matin.
of you, how many of those here had used water before entering this room? Now, this is a very important question. So how many of you, how many of us did use water before coming into the room? Now, this is very important because anything we do, any gesture, any action or activity we do with water has a cost. But of course, at the same time, we also have to be very attentive towards these gestures. And at the same time, I'd also like to come up with another comment, if you allow me to do so. I firmly believe that all of us in this very room, or at least I hope that I'm not wrong, okay, so all of us come from cities, okay, from an urban environment, from metropolis, from cities, big cities, small towns, but from an urban environment. Now, I wonder,
De l'eau potable.
if we brought here a farmer, would there be
Je voudrais savoir
a place where, are there any places in the world where there is no availability of fresh water or drinking water?
qui sont concernés
So
par la rareté
I think
de l'eau.
that
La rareté de l'eau.
all of those who go through the everyday struggle for water, and those who don't have the opportunity to consume fresh water, healthy water each and every day, and who just received water as a blessing coming from the sky in terms of precipitation, or those who also try to use undersurface waters, groundwater, to have access to water, and sometimes they have to dig down to 200 to 300 meters to be able to find water. In the Sahara region, under the sand and the soil of Sahara, this is a huge area, which is a deserted area, which is desert. We actually have to cover 1,600 kilometers before we find a well of 200 meters in depth. And I think that water, and this is something that we pronounced this morning, so water and access to water is a human right. I think this is one of the most important basic rights. Now, what are we going to do? What are we going to do in order to ensure that water serves the purpose of everyone and the interest of everyone? If we start out from the African continent, from Central Africa, now there, more than 50% of water resources are in Central Africa. So more than 50% of African water resources are in Central Africa. And then in North Africa, there's another big area of access. But in other areas of Africa, in other parts of Africa, what are we going to do? Madam Minister, Her Excellency mentioned that we have duties in terms of climate changes. She raised the question what we are going to do in this respect. What are we going to do? And what are these African countries and other countries in the world, what are these countries going to do in order to ensure that their population has access to water? The 2030 strategy says that everyone has a right to access to water. Therefore, it is our basic duty and responsibility that all who cannot have access to drinking water today, they should have. Let me just refer to Chad. Chad is a country which is very much exposed to climate changes, and this is a huge country. Currently, they only have 25,000 square kilometers of area where they have water surface, surface water. This is the Tanganyika, Lake Victoria and Lake Tanganyika. These are freshwater lakes, but these are just shrinking. What are we going to do in order to gain fresh water from salt water? Now, I think, or I hope very much, that at the end of this meeting, at this summit, we will have a common understanding of the practical solutions. I'm really very sorry. We can make, beautiful speeches here. We can say whatever we like. But we come here, we just take a shower and wash ourselves each and every morning. And we just, spill several million cubic meters of water. Now, there are areas where there are 13 million people living. And if all of them would just use 1 liter of water a day, just 1 liter of water a day, that already would be 13 million liters of water per day. And I think this really tells us a lot. And this water, if this water is not recycled, if it's not treated, then that water is just gone. It is just lost. So by 2025, in the time horizon of 2025, there are a lot of things we have to deal with in terms of Africa. But we need to be capable of phrasing this clearly. There are joint strategies, the 2050, the 2030, 2025 strategy, but we need specific plans of action in order to provide people with water. I am looking for a very specific actions or activities, because in the Sahara there is water, and Mauritania and between Mauritania and Djibouti you have roads. Why couldn't we have water ducts and water pipes to Djibouti? Why cannot we just have salt water pumped there and then desalinating that water? There are European NGOs who do really think about these projects. Of course, it would cost several million euros, or several billion euros probably, but if we can use that in order to promote agricultural activity and to provide drinking water for the population, then this is a very important opportunity. And yes, indeed, together with Madam Minister, Her Excellency, I can just say that there are several billion people in this world who are looking forward to seeing solutions so that we can save this continent, so that we can save the entire Earth. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Very tough act to follow. Do you value water? Yes? I heard a yes. A couple people. Do you value water to its full cost, to the right way? Let's turn to our panel and find out. Maybe before we do that, let me ask each one of them to introduce ourselves. Why don't we start with Poi, if you can introduce yourself briefly to the audience, and then we'll go around introductions, and then we'll start off the conversation.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Pio Vanopst. I'm from Switzerland, and I'm a strong believer that water can be a vehicle for peace. So I believe in blue peace.
Great, Frank.
Hello, I'm Frank Rijsberman. I'm the Director General of a new intergovernmental organization, the Global Green Growth Institute, a club of countries that believe that we need a green transition and transition to economic growth that is both sustainable and inclusive.
Great, Olcay.
Good afternoon. My name is Olcay Ünver. I'm the Vice Chair of UN Water. Our chair, Mr. Humbo, talked about UN Water this morning, so I won't have to tell you about UN Water. I am hosted at the FAO headquarters in Rome.
Great.
Hello, my name is Elisabeth van Duin. I'm the Water Director of the Ministry of Transport and Water Management of the Netherlands. I'm here on behalf of our minister, and she is a commissioner in the Global Commission on Adaptation.
Good afternoon. My name is Rochi Khemka. I'm Global Partnerships Coordinator and Asia Water Specialist at 2030 Water Resources Group, which is currently hosted within the World Bank. We essentially work through multi-stakeholder collaboration in trying to close the gap between water demand and water supply, taking a longer-term perspective. So that's where the 2030 in the name comes from. Thanks.
So great. Her Excellency told us that water has spiritual value, cultural value that need to be accounted for, brought into this conversation. Our ambassador told us that perhaps we ourselves are not valuing water in our day-to-day interactions and that we need to rethink our relationship. Olcay, what does valuing water mean? What is the value of water? How does this work within the SDG context, and does it relate to the SDGs at all?
Yes. First of all, valuing water is key to proper water resources management. And UN Water earlier this year identified valuing water important enough a topic that the theme for the World Water Day for 2021 will be valuing water. And as a result of that, we had a meeting of UN Water about a month ago discussing all these issues. So I can report to you with fresh feedback from our meeting. So valuing water means many things to many people. From a United Nations perspective, and if the UN represents a global agreement, then the three pillars of the United Nations Charter, which are peace and security, human rights, and development, they all have something to do with water, and this relates to the value of water in each one of these pillars. There are four perspectives that relate to both the cost and the value and potentially the price of water. The first perspective is the resource, water as a resource. So what is in rivers, what is as a source, what is under the ground, for which you have to take measures to protect the resource, to make sure that it's properly stored, properly prepared for redistribution or to continue ecosystem services, and that comes with a value. And most of the environmental values lie here in this particular perspective. The second perspective is the service perspective, which relates to WASH services, drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene, in which you take the water from a service, treat it to the required degree, and then provide it to people, which has a cost, a price, and a big value. And here the value can be measured in multiple terms, in terms of human health, productivity, disease avoided, and that sort of thing. The third one is the value that the minister mentioned, the intangible values, the cultural, spiritual, religious, social values coming from the individual and community and social value systems. And these are very difficult to put numbers on or indicators, but you can still look at them as to whether or not you are paying proper attention, respectful to spiritual values, etc. And some of these can actually interfere with the other value systems, and especially with the pricing systems. And the fourth one is the most tangible one. That is the water that is input into economic sectors, such as agriculture, industry, energy, for which you definitely have to have some sort of pricing strategy, hopefully reflecting the value and the cost, but also you can use metrics coming from these respective sectors, and SDGs and the targets and the indicators can play a big role in incorporating these into values, such as water use efficiencies, water productivity, and the specific efficiencies in each of these sectors that can be linked back to the SDG indicators and targets, as well as those that cannot be tangibly described, but can be put in indicators such as the quality of water, the amount of service level, and other social, environmental, and less tangible uses of water.
Okay, well, that's helpful. So we have these four dimensions, some of which you might be able to do indicators around, but Frank, you're a very bottom line guy, right? You look at inputs and outputs, costs and benefits. Can you take valuing of water and actually incorporate it into an exchange where you're looking at costs and benefits across water, food, agriculture? I mean, how do you take this valuing water and make it real in the management of water resources? And I'll come
Yes,
back.
you can, but do we want to? I mean, here we had a very technical and very correct explanation of all the different elements of water value, from which you wouldn't realize how controversial a subject the value of water is, right? You know, I'm old enough that I was in the Dublin meeting in 1992, where innocently people that saw that there was a lot of water wasting and not a lot of efficient use of water, we thought it was a good idea to say we should recognize the economic value that water has, not realizing what backlash that would cause from people that said, no, it is a human right. And we have had endless discussion in the last decades over the seeming conflict between water as a human right and the value or the price of water, right? And of course, governments have a responsibility to make a minimum amount of water, we can argue over how much, available as a human right, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they should subsidize water to, it has almost no value for agriculture where it gets wasted, right? So it is a remarkably controversial subject where I think we recognize that for all the right reasons, because governments want to make water available at a subsidized rate to poor people, because it is a human right, we end up subsidizing it for many users who then don't get the right signal for an efficient use. And of course, the other thing is, because a lot of the cost that water users create is through pollution, which is an external downstream cost that doesn't face the user but other people, that's another complication that we have to somehow bring into this right way of both valuing and pricing water. Now, I think actually countries like South Africa or the Middle East have something else. They have, in a way, a scarcity value, right? So maybe the government doesn't put a price on water, but when it becomes scarce, I think the minister gave a very good indication, then that automatically gives you a strong signal of what the real value of water is and can help us drive behavior in the right direction.
So risk aversion has a value.
Yes. And I won't have time to talk about it long, but I see a wonderful connection between energy, water, and climate change, if you like, where we now start to realize that a large part of the cost of water is its energy component. And if we can link that, for instance, to renewable energy, to solar pumping, we may be able to have a quasi-price of water. I could talk about that for a long time, but I have colleagues in the International Water Management Institute in India who formed cooperatives of farmers who have solar pumps, and they use some of that water for, some of that energy for pumping water, and then sell the remainder to the grid. And then, of course, the price you set for that energy de facto becomes a quasi-water price as well. I find that a very fascinating opportunity.
Is valuing water a balance to the human right to water in some respects? The human right to water, which might suggest that it's an intrinsic value that every human gets in a certain way, versus valuing water, which is, no, we need to think about water within the context in which it's delivered and our day-to-day existence, and do these things balance each other a little bit? Madam Minister, you had a comment.
Thank you very much. I have been wanting to intervene. When we were given this topic, I was struck by the incongruence. There just didn't seem to be any connection between what we're talking about in the value of water and in the cost of water. Because implicit in the value of water is the sentiment around water. What is the value to the person or to a country of that particular asset? Whereas what I'm hearing now is the value in monetary terms. So if we can work out exactly what type of value we're talking about, I think we will get to the end in a much better way. Because the reason why it would have been a very controversial topic when you use that determination of value and associated with resources is because for most countries it is a human right and therefore should not carry costs. But the value that we would attach to it is very different from the value of the cost.
So maybe turn to the Netherlands. You have a history of looking at water from a value perspective, but what does this mean in a real sense, and how do you make that value calculation? Is it based on individual perceptions, or is it based on an economic analysis that you do independently? How has the Netherlands struggled with this set of issues?
I think our prime strategy is collectivity. I have to take you back in history. 800 years ago, there were only farmers building levees together to keep from flooding. So it was not really about the value of water, but the risk for flooding. They formed communities. We call them water authorities. And at the beginning of this century, we had about 1,100 in our small country. Of course, that was not very efficient, so they merged, and by now we have 21. The main issue is, why is this still a successful model? Because there are other countries and they have water authorities. I learned during lunch from my Hungarian colleague that the water authorities here don't longer exist. They are centralized. So then you want to ask the question, why are the water authorities in the Netherlands still successful, and why do we want to export this model? And that's because it's a model based on collectivity. It's not only an organization. A water authority can in taxes and organize elections. So the people who have the real concern, they are on the board. So they can really talk about their own interests. The water authorities used to be only busy with flooding. They're now also with wastewater treatment and freshwater availability. And especially that you have an accountability, a collective financial control. I think that is, even though it focuses a lot of costs, it's still a major issue about valuing. Of course, every country has difficulty learning, so have we. So even though we have these water authorities for ages, sometimes we get lost in our own priorities. So sometimes we have to learn from crisis. We had a big crisis in 1953. A large part of the Netherlands flooded, even though we had the water authorities. And then we learned that we need also a bigger plan, and a plan which also involves communities. The Dutch government has €1 billion a year. It's for protection against flooding and for fresh water availability. But even though it's money that's issued by the government, with all the local communities, provinces, counties, together we make the plan. So it's not a centralized plan. It's everyone who has an issue, who is a stakeholder, is involved. And I think that's the key of the valuing water.
It's very interesting. And, you know, the idea of devolving decision-making and engaging the local stakeholders as a way of then finding what the right value of water is to the actual users, I think is critically important. One of the first examples for me when I was exposed to this was around water markets and the creation of water markets among farmer groups, where a farmer group where you couldn't price the water among the farmer group. But if you could cap the total amount of water that went into the farmer group and then let the farmers begin to trade whether or not they were going to use water for certain crops, or then let it go to another farmer for some sort of exchange in some way, shape, or form, all of a sudden the collective of farmers realized they could produce more food with less water and make more money. And, you know, I remember playing this little game in Pakistan with a bunch of farmers, and when they were done, they looked up and said, "You cheated." And I said, no, actually all we did was we created value for water. We didn't cost it. We didn't set the cost of water. We didn't make that determination for you. You each valued water in your own way. All we did was create the venue for you to be able to express that value with each other and to be able to trade it appropriately. So I think this idea of devolving down to the stakeholders is critically important. But this is a tough way of working. If we're going to take on this valuing of water approach, What does this mean to how we start engaging with other governments, with other stakeholders in the way we do our development work? Poi, does this change our approach to how we support developing countries in their work on water? Please.
Thank you. And thank you, by the way, to the Netherlands for pushing for this Value for Water initiatives and the reminder that it's something that is related to collectivity. Now, if you allow me, because I'm not really a water expert, if you allow me, I would just like to quote the New York Times of yesterday, first page. As plans for damming the lower Mekong gathered force in early 2000, the Mekong River Commission predicted that its 4 members would reap 30 billion in benefits. But a reassessment years later by the same commission produced a different forecast. The economies of the lower Mekong countries will take a 7 billion hit if the planned hydropower projects go ahead. What does it mean? Are they crazy or what in making the calculation? How can they make such a big mistake? My reading is, I'm not judging, I never judge anybody. What made sense at the beginning of 2000, maybe it doesn't make sense in 2020 or 2019. Meanwhile, population grew. Meanwhile, we have climate change. Meanwhile, we are recognizing that it's not just about pricing water and then when we solve the problem, but it's a matter to come back a little bit back and valuing water. And what does it mean then? So the approach that we had in the past as a development cooperation, since it was a question, we were kind of, technical. We said integrated water resource management will solve it. By the way, nowadays, with the youth interested in water, as soon as you said integrated water resource management, they're already falling asleep because it's too long. So actually, to realize that this is the technicality of it, but actually what is important is to consider water as in an entry point and water as an entry point. And actually, if you imagine that water comes in a certain quantity or quality and then goes out at the end with the same quantity or quality, this means you manage, since you have a circular economy, suddenly you manage to integrate valuing and pricing in the same discussion. If you are not getting there, if at the end of the uses of the water I'm from Switzerland, upstream country, relatively easy for us, relatively, because when we have to discuss with France in summer what we do with the water, whether we send it out to cool off the nuclear power station, a problem we didn't have 3-4 years ago, I can tell you is another kind of discussion. Okay, what does it mean? It means that actually, if we manage collectively, and actually the champions for this are in Africa, West Africa, the best ones, to discuss the needs among different actors. Different actors, it's about needs, it's about from energy to ecotourism, passing via potable water and irrigation. If you manage to discuss it and come up with a plan that is really negotiated, first, it's a better financial plan. Sure, because there is no one that says the winner takes it all. So I want to come with a huge dam and then maybe make it a little smaller because I have to consider the other interests there. So if we manage to get to this and then find the way that the negotiations are structured and institutionalized and to come to an agreement, this is the reason why you are mentioning your history, because this is the point, then you're ready to go for it, even for investment and even for difficult discussion about pricing. And this is where we are now working, supportive partners going in this direction. It's not easy, but it's doable. And then we get peace.
It's doable. But you're rooting this in personal perceptions, right? This is about, you said respecting needs, but if we take a values approach, needs are in the eye of the beholder. My needs are different than her needs, but you still need to value those needs differently. How does that really work? How do you pay for that? How do you make that happen? How do you make it happen in a transboundary context? right? When you may have very big differences in values and approaches across borders, across cultural groups, across different tribal communities. How do you deal with it in those situations?
A very quick tentative of an answer. You become all shareholders of all the investments, because then you have to negotiate. You negotiate what does it mean to you, but also to listen what does it mean for somebody else. And the solution, of course, is not going for pricing and full recovery of the costs or none of it. And this is the reason why the future will be working on blended finance and so on, because at the end the question will be, okay, how you make sure that the uses, whatever is the use, is going to be sustainable. So that you reinject the water, because at the end it's about getting to circular economies. By getting all the needs if you want. If there is also education, you reduce the consumption whenever it's possible. California, they've been doing quite successfully, 30% of a reduction in consumption in the last few years. So of course, you do it all, but this is all negotiated. And then you come up with ideas and you find a place where you get to a compromise.
So you try to come up with objective measures for something that's very subjective.
Sorry, you didn't get the...
Yeah, the fact that it's just, that it still means something to me. My water is going to mean something to me. And even more, my risk aversion might be much different than your risk aversion. The Netherlands may have come up with a very sound way of managing risk due to floods and things like that, but a South African may now today feel much different about drought risk than they felt 5 years ago. And how do you account for those shifting values in these situations?
But this is the reason why you have to institutionalize processes, because you have to come back consistently, because things changes all the time. And this is what you have to accept.
Sorry, we've got multiple hands up, but go ahead, please.
Well, a nice example is, I think, because the Netherlands and Switzerland, with France, Germany, and Belgium, and Luxembourg, and Liechtenstein, together are in the International Committee for the Management of the Rhine. And that committee exists, I think, for more than 50 years. It was installed because we had flooding problems. But now, recently, the committee has broadened its horizon because we have many droughts in Europe as well. And if you can see that in our parliament, the question was raised, we have to go and speak with Switzerland, Germany, and everyone about a new way to have a deviation of water different for the Netherlands, because we are getting less and less. And then we said, no, we go to this international committee because it has established a way of talking to each other, of rules. Ministers meet each other every 2 years. So there is, that's why I nodded, because there's a kind of consistency. You build relationships, even transboundary, which is much more difficult, I agree with the minister, than inside your country it's difficult. But transboundary, talking about water less or more, is even more difficult. But you need that continuity in the discussion. And that's also, again, the accountability, which I talked about.
So our minister from Slovakia was exactly right. It's all about governance. It's about institutional mechanisms that sustain a dialogue and discourse around the value of water within the different contexts in which we use it, whether it's on the farm, whether it's in a city, whether it's transboundary. Am I getting closer? Maybe? Madam Minister, and then we'll go to His Excellency.
Thank you. You're getting closer to what I'd like us to conclude on. You see, value has two different meanings. It could be a noun, which describes how you relate to it, its worth and its merit. But the value that I hear now being talked about is the value in relation to pricing. Am I correct? Because when you're talking about the kind of cross-boundary arrangements that we have, this is a different value. This is a value now that you put a price to because of the infrastructure that you have to build in, because of what you put into that particular value. So unless we define what we're talking about, I think we're going to be going round in circles, and I'm still stuck on which value are we talking about. Eventually, it'll help us get to a point of, if we're talking about a pricing value, what do we base it on? What is the measurement? What is the unit measurement of that?
Right, right. So this is not an academic question for our minister, right? This is a real problem that must be solved on a day-to-day basis around all the different contexts and uses of water. And the value of water may mean different things in those different contexts and how you work it. Please, Your Excellency.
Moi, je pense qu'il faut aller terre à terre. Il n'y a pas de frontières pour l'eau. Prenons le cas d'un fleuve qui commence en Ouganda pour aller se terminer à Cape Town. Il y a des fleuves, c'est naturel, donc vous ne pouvez pas échapper. On ne peut pas vraiment interdire les passages quoi qu'il advienne.
Uganda, there are natural factors, and we cannot forbid rivers to flow until the point that they naturally flow to. My first remark would be, first of all, everybody has a right to access water. It's a human right which all of us share. Everybody needs to be granted access to water on this planet. And I think this is the United Nations mandate and also the mandate of leading nations. Individual countries are not able to face this challenge on their own. It's impossible. But if we have a joint goal, a common objective on the level of global strategy, then I think it's compulsory, and I want to underline it. It's compulsory. We must go beyond our egoism. The UN is able to provide financial means, and the UN is able to implement strategies. We have heard about the remarkable achievements of the Netherlands, and Netherlands is an open country, but naturally they had their financial limits. If we think in terms of a continent, or if we think in global context, I think mobilization is a key issue. The value of water must be a symbolic value. We mustn't forget, though, that in order to have enough access to water, we need to invest capital, capital which comes from nations, from countries. Capital is needed in order to ensure access to water for all.
Our minister is still trying to reconcile values and costs. Rochi, you're dealing with lots of investments. How do you prioritize investments in countries? Now we're talking about a human right to water, which may or may not come with a value or a cost. It certainly comes with a cost. But we have real problems around how we actually build infrastructure, sustain infrastructure, ensure it continues to deliver. How do we begin to think this through when we're making investments? How does the value of water factor into our investments?
I think, first of all, it's important to understand the challenges facing us. By the year 2030, there's expected to be a 40% gap between water demand and water supply. On the other hand, World Bank estimates that by 2050, water scarcity compounded by climate change is expected to cost some regions 6% of GDP. That's not a small number. So there's the physical scarcity on the one hand, but there's also implications on economic growth. And in a lot of cases, that's on account of a lack of an appropriate price for water, which accounts for its full value. When I say value, I mean social, economic, and ecological, not just one of these dimensions. We often find that there is no correlation between the price for water and its availability or its quality. In some cases, you find that where water is more scarce, it is actually cheaper. So there is, of course, the dimension of making water available for all users and all users, where we transform it from just being a natural resource into one that provides services, and that then we try and recover and put back into nature. So I don't want to make this theoretical. Let me give you an example of how we're looking at translating this into investment. So in the country of Bangladesh, we've established a national multi-stakeholder platform where valuing water is one of the key themes. So there's a high-level panel reporting into the Prime Minister's office that has been set up on this topic. And it's a three-stage process of engagement. The first stage is to come up with a harmonized set of shadow prices for water. So the first step is to account for the full value of water across its various dimensions, which is very important. Accounting for all the complexity in water, so variances by sector, by source, by region, by season, that's part of it. A third element is ensuring that there is comparability and a consistent framework that guides these differentiated approaches, and then also building trust. So multi-stakeholder approach is very much needed because that's where you get the full breadth of the values on the table to be then able to take to the next stage. So the next stage for us in this is linking this to public decision-making processes through development, project proposals, having a harmonized manual and guidelines for doing that, creating buy-in across all the line ministries, not just water, which again is critical. So it is very much a nexus approach. It's not sitting in one bucket alone, and making sure that it's getting really to the heart of how decisions are taken. And then step 3 is why limit it only to the public sector? There's also a dimension of bringing in private sector decision-making and thinking about how understanding the value of water impacts on private sector decisions as well as on the business model. And it often leads to changes or improvements in water use efficiency, thinking about circular economy solutions, conservation actions, also looking at compensation, risk assessments for private sector. It's important to create demonstration cases for how that works, creating the awareness for how value of water translates into impact for private sector, and of course providing incentives which move companies and corporates in that direction. So I think when valuing water is integrated with policy making and decision making, it leads to more sustainable water resources management, and that has two dimensions. It's long-term economic growth, which is very important, but it also looks at the dimension of equitable access to water, again, which is very, very important. In fact, in the country of South Africa, where we're also engaged, and the minister is a strong champion, the value that local communities and stakeholders are placing on water is leading to prioritization in a different direction. So, for instance, a mine water coordinating body has been set up for the largest coal mining area, which brings together 5 of the mining companies with 3 different departments from government, so mining, environment, and water, together with local communities and civil society. Again, bring all the stakeholders around the table to identify what the values are. And in this case, the prioritization that's coming out of it is to have more circular economy solutions and reuse between the mining sector and agriculture, which wouldn't necessarily have happened unless they were all sitting and discussing the challenges together.
So a quick question in that process, and I appreciate going back to the institutional point and the idea of stakeholder engagement to get to the value of water. You mentioned the word shadow price. What did you mean when you said that?
Well, there's 2 aspects to water. One is the physical cost of water itself. There's also a scarcity value associated with water, which is often not accounted for. It is making the cost of pollution apparent. It is making the cost of non-availability of water apparent. So as you identify the values, making sure that all of these different aspects are incorporated into what we call the shadow price of water to then lead into decision making. And I want to stress that the value of water is often thought of as a number. It's not a number to get to the best level of granularity with all the decimal points in place. I think it's very much a process, and a collaborative process at that. Because when you account for these different values and you create the ownership and the accountability at different levels of stakeholder groups and across different stakeholder types, that's when you really get to translating that value into activities and action.
Okay, so we've got processes and thoughts and ideas about how you can work with collections of individuals, peoples, communities to figure out how they value water. So you can get to some sort of valuation of water. Let's say you don't agree with their valuation. How do you incentivize how do you increase the value of water? How do you build or incentivize people to value water more than they might be valuing now, so that they then treat water differently, as the minister was saying? If everybody in this room valued water, maybe we would have behaved differently in the few minutes before we walked into this room. The question is, what can we do to incentivize individuals to value, or communities to value water more? Olcay?
Well, I guess it boils down to your earlier comment on governance, that it should be on participatory and adaptive governance systems. And the spine of this will be the governments, because governments should not only be able to reconcile the different value systems that might exist in a society, but they should also make the playing field level. Because in addition to the different value systems, different sectors might have different agendas, different priorities, and different buying powers, which could potentially distort the overall scheme of values, prices, and costs. And this lies with the governments to regulate, incentivize, and then also establish or help establish, catalyze the establishment of partnerships and bring awareness to a higher level. So that's the governmental national level. At a higher level, when it comes to transboundary issues or things like human right to water, United Nations has the ability and provides the platform for the ambitions of the member states to make this more official, agree on this, and then put targets and bring incentives and potentially catalyze funding that would make these happen. And of course, the UN system is not a funder itself, but through the partnerships that it can provide, and like Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Climate Accord, the Sendai Framework, etc. These frameworks can actually catalyze the involvement of private sector and the financial community, bringing in the value of water, be it numeric values ranging from economic considerations, but also values that are not tangible, such as dignity, safety, security from extremes of water, which cannot be properly put in numbers, but should be factored in into the policies. And this is the level and the platform that can be done at the international fora.
Madam Minister, that sounds like a very hard thing to do. I mean, I'm not sure they're giving you the help that you need.
No, not at all, not at all. But I wanted to come back to the issue that you raised. How do we raise the awareness of the value of water to the extent that you are able to explain why it is priced, so that it would be a gradient way? We were lucky when, well, it wasn't lucky then, but we have the experience of having had a drought in the Western Cape. And we were going down to day 0. And the people of the Western Cape, especially in Cape Town, had to cut back significantly on the amount of water that they were using. And at that point, it became very clear to them just how important water is, as opposed to the normal way in which societies, or at least our society, uses water, as though it is something that is perennially there and will be there forever. So with us, at this particular juncture in our history, we were able to put across the position of water and the possibility that it is an expensive venture. Because even after we had done and the drought was over, the infrastructure we had to put in place was very costly. So the interaction with the community presupposes that already they value in terms of the merit, the water. And therefore, it would be possible to put a particular added value to that to make sure that all the infrastructure is catered for.
So Rochi and Olchai both suggest education is a key part of building awareness around the values of water. The minister says a disaster helps, right?
Not quite in that way. Not quite in that way.
Not that she's advocating for disasters, right? It's certainly true for us in the United States. It took a major drought on the East Coast that then led to a piece of legislation about how we deal with those things, that we valued water differently after a major impact. Sorry, there were, please, Elizabeth.
I have a very short notion, but the very cynical motto of the Dutch water authorities is never waste a good crisis.
Exactly right. Frank? Sorry, Olchai.
But this is also what the President of Hungary, His Excellency, was talking about this morning. He said that Hungary had excessive rains and flooding, and they had to invest heavily in levees, and that was costly, but it wasn't as costly as the damage that these floods would have caused the next time. So that is, you know, these are some of the things that governments or decision makers should either live through or anticipate.
Right, so as good government officials, we should be prepared for the next water-related disaster. So as soon as it happens, we can begin to engage the right stakeholders and communities on the next steps, and because that'll provide us the incentive to get there.
Well, Hungary was doing it ahead of time. They were anticipating it. So this is what I'm getting. So you can anticipate. And of course, with climate change, anticipation has become more and more challenging, but still you can anticipate and act accordingly.
That's true.
Without having to go through these crises.
Yeah, I know in the U.S. we still have challenges along the, is Joe Mann still out here? You know, along the Mississippi, trying to get everybody to think about drought and the 50-year, 100-year events. They still don't want to pay for that kind of stuff. It's still a little bit of a challenge. Poi, you had a comment? Oh, sorry, okay, Rochi.
I think there's a tendency to think of valuing water as only a cost-benefit analysis. I think it goes beyond that because there is, there are trade-offs involved, and there are costs of inaction, right? So when we're saying, how do we increase the value of water? Not every country can wait for a crisis to come along and say, look, now all of a sudden we're valuing it more. We're able to see it also through the cost of not doing anything or the cost of mismanagement. And some of these already have numbers pegged to them. So for instance, global costs associated with water scarcity is $94 billion to food producers and consumers. There's a cost from floods of $120 billion annually on account of property damage. There's also costs from inadequate water and sanitation, which is in the range of $260 billion. So there are all these costs that are waking up stakeholders to the value of water. Is it at the level and urgency that we want? Probably not. I don't think there is a sort of a common understanding across all the stakeholders, so much more needs to be done in raising the awareness. And I agree with the earlier point about creating institutional strengthening to be able to drive this. And going back to the point that I made, when we talk about institutional strengthening, it's not just in the physical sense of an institution. It's also who are the types of stakeholders that you bring forward to get the right discussion and being able to see through all the possible outcomes that may play out.
Frank, help me out here. Look, I want to agree with her. I really do. But I don't think you can come up with all the numbers in the world. I think when you have numbers and you're presenting it to groups about the costs, the benefits, sometimes that works, sometimes that makes a difference, but a lot of times it can be completely discounted as somebody advocating in their own self-interest. I think a crisis which makes it tangible for individuals, where they can see it on their farm, they can see it when they turn on their tap, they can see it in the health and well-being of their family and their livelihoods, I think that's what moves people to action.
I don't think we have the luxury of waiting for a crisis to roll around everywhere.
I agree with you. I just think it goes against human nature. But Frank, you tell me if I got it wrong.
And luckily we have plenty of crises, right? So I would agree. I mean, as a good Dutch water engineer, indeed, never waste a good crisis, but also, pray God for a small flood, right? You know, that's the other one that you
Right.
Because yes, the engineers even had, you know, in the Netherlands we had the big Delta plan after the big flood in 1953. That stuff was in the drawer of the engineers for a number of years, but there was no willingness to invest, right? Until there was a flood. So, you know, and you see now in climate change, when is the public convinced? Because we see droughts, because we see floods, we see typhoons, we see forest fires. Now we are getting willingness to respond. Now, yes, it would be wonderful if we could all, you know, anticipate. But I think that is very difficult. A good thing we could do at least is respond quickly then and be nimble and hopefully start to respond more quickly than what we've seen with climate change so far, right? I think we now see a growing awareness that we do need to act, and hopefully we haven't talked that much about climate change yet, but many people say when mitigation is all about energy, adaptation is all around water. So what do we do around this rapidly changing value of water as well as we try to work in climate change? I think we have enough crises all around us to use those to prod into action, let's say.
Yes, but we still need a crisis. Poi.
Yeah, if you allow me. I don't know whether to dwell a lot on crisis or hoping for crisis or not. This is...
Well, we're still trying to help the minister. How do we incentivize
What I would like
people?
to see if I manage, it's not, of course, the minister is not easy. I think you're handling one of the most difficult subjects, because there are still at least half of us here that still think about water as a sector. Some few others think of water as a value, cultural value, and so on. All of us, we have different opinions about it. But at the end, I think the solution will be the mix of all these elements we've been talking about, putting together in the right way. What I mean by that? Of course, we were fighting, all of us, for many years to transform the right to water a reality for the humankind. No? This was important. But now we realize it is not sufficient, because we would like to, maybe we should develop a right for water to exist and stay clean. I don't know, or end up clean. Maybe this would be, in the climate terms, this would be something that we should go for it. What does it mean, this? It means that on the one hand, we have the civic engagement. This means me as a human being and inhabitants on this planet, slowly, I have to be aware. When I was 6 years old, and in the small river down my house was one day blue, one day red, one day yellow. I was just happy going back home and say, oh, look, today is yellow, today is red. And my mom would say, don't touch the water, please, because there was an industry just a little bit above there that was polluting the waters. And this was Switzerland, 60s. Now, 100% of the wastewater in Switzerland is treated. And people say, it's because you have money. No, it's not because of the money. It's because we made money available to make this possible. Why? Exactly because most of the water is managed in Switzerland by municipalities, 96%, because they are near to the population, to the problem. They have a delegated authority to run funding, which not everybody does. And so on and so on. So they set up on one hand the expertise to help managing this complex problem. At the same time, you need the education, the civism, and so on. But all these will not function if the political will at the highest level is a little bit shaky. And this is when I'm talking about transboundary. Because yes, we have a way to discuss together, but no, we are not, after 150 years in Europe, we are not as far as on the Senegal River they went 50 years ago, in which all the 4 countries are owning the rivers and assets, the 4 together. There is not this piece is mine, this piece is yours. All the 4, they run it together. This means there is a very strong political commitment that leads then to another way to giving value and then pricing, investment, and so on. So it's all this together that has to be linked. And I think that actually, as I said at the beginning, is doable. Why I think it's doable? Because it happened. It happened on the Senegal River. It's happening now on the Gambia River. It's happening. So this means it's doable. Because if it's not doable, it didn't happen.
Well, maybe we need to turn back to the Senegal, because you raised there were a lot of things tangled up in that statement, but one of which that stuck out for me in particular was, you're talking about wastewater, right? And if my wastewater flows downstream to your country, do I then value that the way you might value that? And if we have differences in our valuation of that, my reaction to that is going to be fundamentally different than your reaction to that.
Yeah, but if you allow me, very concretely, sorry.
Please,
Switzerland and Netherlands, we know perfectly the past. In the beginning of the 80s, we did a monster disaster in Switzerland.
Right.
Because we didn't have the rules and regulation to manage the wastage of the industries in a way that we protect not only ourselves, but we protect everybody downstream. Yes, of course, we had the famous disaster, all the fish is gone, but also this forced not only us, but all the countries along the river to look at the regulation, not only about water and so on, but how you manage industries, where you build industry, and so on and so on.
And you have a common set of values around water within the European Union, right?
That's true.
And that common set of values, and they have a common set of values within some of the river basins that we're seeing in Africa. And that's probably then where that discussion has to go. How do you generate among countries that share water resources a common set of values so that you're then able to value water through institutionalized processes? Maybe. Please.
Maybe this is a good moment to also call upon action, because I agree on it's important that we have a common sense on valuing water, but we also have to take action. And I want to point out to you that the Global Commission on Adaptation, it's the commission led by Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates and Kristalina Georgieva, and 31 members of all over the world. On September 10th, in New York, they presented their flagship report. It's about climate adaptation. I think it's an important movement. And it's very prominent people who are in the lead. And it's in October 2020 in Amsterdam, there will be a new summit, and it will give the results for all the action that's called upon. What made it interesting was that in the beginning, there were 6 action tracks, but none water. And it cost us a lot of people in this community, I think, worked very hard to get an action track on water. And when we discussed this, it was, everyone agreed water is so important, it's in all the tracks. And then we said, this is not enough. Because if you say it's everywhere, no one pays attention. So now there is a water action track. It's, we have the World Bank on board, the Water Resources Institute, and we call on action on all governments, but also industries. I think by now we have 70 pledges already from people working. And the idea is that we get about 300 cities water resilience. We will have resilient river basins, and we want to be more prepared for climate change for water. So I think it's a pledge to join us, and you can find information everywhere.
Please do, but this is a really important point that I think we struggle with. It's not necessarily our valuation of water, it's how we get the agriculture community to value water, the energy community to value water, the health community to value water, those people in healthcare systems and hospitals, how do we get them to value water within a healthcare setting? How do we get all these others to begin to value water within the context in which they're working on water? That's the real type of incentive structure we're trying to build here, please.
Moi, je voudrais profiter pour lancer
Well, we actually do have to make use of the fact that each and every friendly country, I mean, we need to make sure, rather, so that each and every friendly country would be there at these fora. We are here in this water forum, but we need to be there in Dakar, in Senegal as well. We're expecting all of you to come. This is a model country. stemming from its geographical situation and also due to the fact that it's a partner country. It made very important pledges and commitments in terms of not only water but also in terms of wastewater management. Thank you very much.
I was just wondering how much we're going to pay for this advertisement.
Me, very little.
How much are we going to charge him for this advertisement at our cost?
No, it's all good. But now let's see. I still am concerned that we haven't given the minister the answers that she needs. If we're going to create value for water, what are the instruments, what are the tools, what are the modalities that we might use to do that? I appreciate the process point and how we might work with communities to get them to begin to value water. But what about land tenure? What about capping water supplies to specific communities? What about things that might then force communities to say, all right, we now need to reevaluate our approach to water within our user group? What about those tools and instruments? Please, Rochi.
I think I couldn't agree more on the need for action. And just to say, it's not all doomsday. There are things happening. To give a couple more examples, so in Mongolia, in engaging with the stakeholders, it came about that the availability of clean water and reducing wastewater and pollution was a key priority for the stakeholders. And so collectively that led to the introduction of polluter-pays principles, where even industry came forward and said, look, we value the resource. We are willing to pay. Why don't we create a transparent mechanism that allows us to do that together with the government? Because before that, there was no enforcement, there was no collection, there was very little wastewater treatment, and that was impacting everybody. They went a step further to say, okay, now that we have an instrument for looking at wastewater treatment, can we go to also wastewater reuse? Can we think about circular economy solutions and making sure that there's a closed loop cycle? And then a step further to say, okay, now with wastewater reuse, and there were standards implemented in the country, how can we change the tariff system itself to incentivize more reuse and more efficiency? So where, pricing is not the solution to everything. I mean, it's gone through a process of evolution through different instruments to now land up on pricing. I'll give a different example from a different context. In the state of Maharashtra in India, wastewater treatment itself was a key challenge again. And there we're working with partners to create markets for wastewater reuse. So creating a tradable permit for wastewater reuse that allows for cross-sectoral exchanges, and there's a dimension for technology as well. So how can blockchain, for instance, create more transparency and tamper-proof entries that can be enabled? So I think there are new tools and instruments that are coming forward because those values have been identified with the partners.
Well, I get that. And again, if we go back to Olchai's thinking that governments must play a key role in driving that process, there is no question that regulations, standards can do a lot to incentivize private sector behavior and the way they manage water, but then those costs will still get passed down to individuals, and the values of those individuals might not yet have caught up with the government's view of how the government is valuing water in all of its dimensions. And so you're still struggling then with how you reconcile what a government might need to do in order to charge costs and user fees to individuals with how those individuals are valuing water at the end of the day. Sorry, Minister.
I was going to say the flip side of what you're talking about is what is it that society can resort to make sure that government values water in the same way that they do and protects water from being contaminated, kind of examples that we've heard here. I woke up this morning and got a call from my lawyer to say that the Human Rights Commission in South Africa is suing me because of the pollution in one of the major rivers. So that, so there are in our country, for instance, inbuilt mechanisms that make sure that not only the citizens will value water, government has a responsibility to live up to the value that is attached to water. And when we have this acid drain from big business, it is our responsibility to make sure that that is cleaned up. And so for us, we've worked out a dual system of encouraging our citizens, well, I did use an example of a disaster, to value water, but at the same time, when they have valued water, it is a responsibility of government that government protects that water and gives it to them in the cleanest form possible.
And so the key then is, how do you get governments then to value water the same way as their own constituents and people?
Take them to court.
Take them to court. Okay, I'd be the least one to argue with that. I come from a tort law country, so that's certainly how we regulate. Not exactly the same way as Europe, though, so it might not work the same way. If that's the way it's going to work, that these values are going to be set by stakeholders, going back to governments and saying, we need you to take action, we need you to do X, Y, and Z, but the stakeholders don't know everything that we know, right? We know more. We know more about the vulnerabilities. We know more about the crises that are going to happen. How do we educate stakeholders to get more engaged and create the opportunities for them to be more engaged in those processes? Maybe I'll leave you with that and allow you to walk through with any last comments you might have. Maybe we'll start with Rochi and then we'll work along the row.
I think the answer was in your question, is engaging with all the types of stakeholders. I think water being an input to a lot of different sectors, it's important to get different communities together. It's important to have a healthy discussion and dialogue, sometimes bordering on a debate and an argument across different sectors, and really making sure that there is awareness raising on what happens, what are the trade-offs, what are the costs of not engaging on any action. So I think it's a process, like I said. It requires for everybody to be around the same table and recognizes that water it's more than a substance. It is the essence of life, and there is a need to recognize and reconcile these different values and engage on that trajectory, no matter how difficult that is.
Such wise words. I don't have anything to add, I think.
Olcay?
Yes, I have 2 points to make.
Please.
One is about your first question. But I think we as people, we have 2 important functions. We are consumers and we elect governments. So we have to make sure that all these awareness, all the information that we have that is being disseminated extensively through particularly social media is not wasted. So we become better consumers, okay, waste less. And I'm not only talking about water, but I'm talking about food, which causes an enormous amount of water to be lost and energy to be lost, and use our electoral power accordingly. So this is my personal comment. With my UN water hat, I would like to underline the presence of 2 United Nations conventions governing transboundary water cooperation, and the fact that the one for Europe has been operational for many years and is now open to accession by countries other than the members of the Economic Commission of Europe. And actually, many African countries are now acceding to that. And both that one and the global convention do have procedures that would allow the member states, that would level the playing field so they can interact in a more organized environment. And when it comes to providing not only facilitation, but also incentives, the minister from Slovakia was talking about the Sava River, the cooperation around Sava River, and that is a product of the United Nations Water Convention for Europe. So these do exist, and since we have stakeholders and member states, then the UN message here is to make the best use of those.
I think we've certainly managed through this discussion to demonstrate how complex this subject still is and how difficult it is to find simple answers. I do also think that we tend to learn, maybe unfortunately, a lot from crisis and from outcomes that we don't like. but I'm at the same time optimistic with Pio that when we do learn, we can then indeed spread those, and that there is, through cooperation in sometimes complex looking processes, real progress, as we've seen in quite a few areas in the water sector. Now, here we argued partly for the special role of water and having a separate water action track. The flip side of that is that there are also real opportunities to value water in its nexus to agriculture, to energy, and so on, and that we shouldn't ask for looking at water in isolation, I think, but we will have to look at some of these key nexuses, particularly around, I think, climate change and climate adaptation. I'll leave it at that.
Exactly right. Pio?
Thanks. I would, apart from awareness and everything that is said, I would reward with incentives any action that leads to any negotiated or any negotiations that is transboundary in nature, whether it's transboundary national or transboundary sector or transboundary in terms of generation, whatever, but that leads to a compromise, that leads to a plan, an investment plan, and there I would put an incentive, because this investment plan, I would be sure that is one it's worthwhile to bet on. This investment plan, thinking already future. So it's about something that you look on the longer run, and then you fix your investment. And this implies something we didn't discuss, is that the financial sectors, including development banks and development actors, we don't have the right instruments to support this way to go. We still work pretty much sectoral, nation, generation, and the conditionalities we are putting are quite amazing for those that would like to go for a more, let's say, collective approach towards investment.
Moi, je voudrais dire que l'homme a besoin
Engedjék meg, allow me to say something different. Now, it is very important that if we produce, we need water, okay? But we also need water as individuals. We need water for ourselves as well. We know our resources. We are aware of our resources. It's the sky, the soil, and the oceans. These are basically our resources. This is where water comes from. And then, from this point on, it is about pledges and commitments, practical commitments, and this is about means and tools. If today we look at what the Security Council of UN says in terms of security policies, then what we can say is that a lot of crises are already on the table. And I think that water is a similar crisis. And I also believe that, yes, indeed, it is UN, it is the EU, and all countries of Africa and the world. We can mobilize the budget of all of these countries, world organizations and institutions to save water. And of course, the climate change gives another perspective, another framework for that.
I want to answer your question and to say that in all the work in all the talking that has been going on, the element of continuous education, continuous commitment, and ensuring that there is a level of responsibility in society to preserve water and look after water, we will be coming closer to how both the society and ourselves value water. But I agree with the comment made that this has brought up the complexity of the matters that we're dealing with. Well, I'm still stuck in the definition of a word. All of us are dealing with the same concepts as they apply to our particular situation. And I think that this will be an ongoing discussion until at some point we get to a point where we say, look, we have to move towards ensuring that we can get some financial input into the water, and therefore the responsibility will also have to be taken up by the citizens themselves.
I think at the end of the day, you may have stumbled upon the best definition I've heard yet, which is that valuing water is a conversation. And it's that art of conversation at different levels with local stakeholders, with user groups, across regions. It's about institutionalizing that conversation, providing platforms for dialogue, be it a river basin commission, or be it some sort of government-led process to engage others, or some sort of regional process that we might have within a convention or some other agreement, which helps promote a dialogue and a conversation about what our shared values are around water and what those shared values might look like and how we exercise those values then in the management of water resources. Because I think one thing is clear, those values are not universal. They vary from context, person to person, situation from situation, year to year. And so that dialogue process, in other words, right, it sounds like valuing water isn't a noun, it's a verb. It's something that we do. It's something that we do every day. It's not a thing that we can check the box and that say we're done. And that maybe if we can create that common understanding, maybe we don't have to pray to God for a small water crisis. Maybe if we do it right, we can prevent the next water crisis. Thank you very much to the panel.
I would also like to thank the moderators, my moderator and the panelists for the discussion. It was very valuable. Before we have a coffee break, please allow me a couple of more information. There are 2 side events happening right now, or will start soon. One in this hall in Duna Room on the topic of progresses needed in integrated lake basin management to mitigate water crises. The other one at Building D in Tisa Room on realizing the agenda for water action, transforming water policy into action on the ground. I would also like to let you know that there is a cultural event this evening. I'm sure you have heard about it. All of you are invited, so please make sure that you join us later on. Thank you, and we will resume here at 4:30 sharp. Thank you.